Hello and welcome to another episode of the Dualistic Unity movie review series. I am here. I'm just here, not going anywhere. Don't know what's to come. Don't know what's next, and not really worried about it at all. It's just this is it. This is my focus. This is my primary place that I'm at. Not going anywhere. Not becoming anything. Just digging deeper into here.
I am likewise riding out the wave of here because that's really what it feels like when you're just in it. It doesn't feel like you're necessarily doing anything, though you're doing everything. You're just kind of along for the ride that makes sense to you from moment to moment to moment. And you could call that ride free will or just will, but it's a hell of a ride. And the more I experience that ride, the more I recognize that it really is about sensitivity, presence, letting go, having faith in yourself, very much like it would be if you were just learning how to surf. On that note, this Dualistic Unity movie review is all about The Peaceful Warrior, which came out in 2006 and stars Scott Mechlowicz, Nick Nolte, and Amy Smart. I've seen this movie a few times. It is based on a novel that was written in 1980 by Dan Millman. The novel is very different to the movie. So I really like what they did in this movie in terms of simplifying it and making it more applicable to pretty much everybody's experience. It's really easy to digest. I'm not going to say anything more about this movie because, frankly, I'm really curious about Andrew's thoughts.
And I'm not convinced that you exist. Which is probably I don't know. I feel like for these we can just bounce around. But yeah, that's pretty much the main thing I took away. As much as I think the one of the big takeaways most people get out of this is you don't need an excuse to be happy. You don't need the goal and the accomplishment because we're always just utilizing the experiences that we have as an excuse. We have something coming up. I can't be happy until this goes well. And then everything's on the line because if it doesn't go well, then you can't be happy for so much longer and all of that. But beyond that, at the towards the end there when he shows up, and just before we get into all the spoilers, watch the movie if you haven't. Rainer, I know you're not going to, so enjoy the episode. But towards the end there, when he shows up to the gas station on his way to the qualifier, and he's not there. Sock isn't there. It hit me, and just how it may be true, and it is true, that no one's ever there. He was using him potentially. Could have been a Fight Club type thing where he was a figment of his imagination. I think Joy was the only one who ever actually met with Socrates that he knew, or Sock, or whatever we're going to call him. So it just hit me that, well, what if? Because I was, of course, thinking of it like kind of Ray and my relationship a little bit. Obviously, probably came up as you could imagine, and it hit me like, what if Ray doesn't really exist? And it's not that it's not true. So yeah, excited to get into that.
That's funny. I was wondering if you would take that away from the end of the movie. And that's very much how it is different from the novel. You don't really get that impression from the novel. But in this movie, when Socrates or Nick Nolte's character isn't around at the end, you really do get the impression that maybe he never really existed. And then you think back to when Dan was like wearing the overalls and like cleaning stuff up, and you're like, did Dan just have a night job and was talking to himself? Right? Is he the one that set up the rings for himself? And he's like, no, he did it, like all of that. So yeah, no, that's an interesting take on the movie for sure, but I don't know. That said, you're never going to be sure that I'm real or anyone else, which is part of the fun in itself, right? But I think the point is that these lessons, these insights are always there. And that is all Socrates' character was really trying to get across, is that life itself is the lesson. Life is the journey. Life is the point. This is where you are either in the warrior mentality or you're not in the here and now, because it's the act of being in the here and now that is the warrior mentality. Right? It's an act of responsibility. It's an act of awareness. And so I really enjoyed Socrates' character, regardless if he existed or not. The fact is that he was a conduit for insight, and that's what we all are.
Yeah, I was pretty impressed by how much of this movie focused on being here now. Like the only thing that's real, the only moment that exists. And going through it, just thinking back to playing sports growing up and how it was rarely about doing the action for the sake of the action. It was always with an ulterior motive. And oftentimes that would be a great motivator, and especially in practice and training and whatnot. But a lot of times it would be a huge detriment. And it's always that double-edged sword whenever you're focused on anything outside of the moment, and you're not fully paying attention. And I think people think of that, he when he first does the horse thing and he comes back to Zach and he's like, I learned your trick, used your trick, and it was awesome. Like I did so well, I crushed it, blah blah blah. And he's like, you're no longer here, you're back there, you're back in the past. And so people can think of it like a trick, and like there's some sort of supernatural sort of thing. And I'm not saying there isn't potential in that, but it really is, how do I put this? It's not something out of this world being attentive to where you're at. Like when he's at the park and he's after he gets I think this is after he gets pushed off the bridge, and he is looking around, he's like, nothing's happening, and then Sock grabs his shoulder and he like sees everything that's happening. Like that isn't a superpower necessarily. It's just highlighting how little we're paying attention. And so when it comes to the competition, so few of us are fully involved in the thing that we're doing, giving it actually 100% attention. Max, maybe like 80% would probably be like super intense attention, but there's still, the thoughts of what it's going to mean, where it's going to go, what you're going to get out of it. And so actually giving something 100% attention is just such a higher level of attention that there could be the possibility of performing like insane things that most would deem incapable by humans. But it's not that it's some otherworldly thing. It's just that we aren't giving things the fullness of attention that we could if we let go of the attachments of the goals, of the endpoints, of the reason for doing something, and we're just doing it, actually just doing it for the sake of doing it. I think there's a ton of potential in that we just have hardly even seen.
Well, because how fragile are we, right? Like how easy is it to shake us or our ability to perform? And one thing I really enjoyed about the beginning of the movie when they first meet is he's so full of himself, right? Like, yeah, I'm going to be in the Olympics. It's going to mean so much about me. And then he asks Socrates, do you watch the Olympics? And he's like, no. And you could just see him visibly deflate because all of a sudden it doesn't seem important to this person. In fact, they're looking at it as kind of irrelevant. And so all of a sudden, all of your puffed up pride, all of that stuff that goes into you achieving this thing is all of a sudden not a playing piece in the conversation anymore. You can't use it as a way to feel more valuable. And that was it. That's exactly how hard it is to shake that mentality. I don't really think that's important. This is one of the things that I've actually noticed in my own life when I've met somebody or I've worked with somebody and they were very materialistic and they would show me something and be like, isn't this rad? And I'm just like, yeah, that's great. And that's it. And it's sincere, but I'm not thinking to myself, if only I had one, because I don't value that thing. And so it becomes less effective as a means of them feeling better about themselves. And it's only because you're not taking it as seriously. But he's used to being surrounded by people who are also competing for that same goal, for that same feeling of finally having everything I want, and therefore I'll be happy. This is one thing I really enjoyed at the end of the movie, was when he was talking to the other competitor and he could hear everything that he had been saying to Socrates early on in the journey, and he couldn't help but see how far he had come. because he's like, it's not a trick, it's really just getting rid of the garbage. And the guy's like, how? Like, are we not here for the gold? Like, that's what we're here for. This is everything this is about. And meanwhile, Dan had come so far that it wasn't about that for him. He wasn't there for the gold at all. He was there for the chance to be there. And that must have hit really hard to see that contrast. And it does, to see that contrast, like to see somebody who has come so far along the journey and then to see them meet somebody who's still early on. It's an experience in itself. It's something that I've experienced a number of times, including in this podcast with you and with a great many of our community members, just to see how far they've come. Because I myself have come so far in terms of being here and now. And that was it. It's just being here now. One of my favorite lines in this movie, and it's something I've actually referenced in the podcast previously. Couldn't tell you what season. It was about, I practice everything. I love that line because it's true. That's what life is. It's not about getting good at one thing. It's about being good at living, being good at being yourself, being good at not having to be good and just doing what you're doing without any other reason, because that's where you find mastery.
Exactly, because when you're sitting in eternity, might as well stick your hand in everything. So when he was talking to his friend, or when his friend was talking to him towards the end of the movie there, I think it really sunk in. Like I think it seemed, given his response and facial expression, that he wasn't even considering that he was there for the gold. And it kind of hit him, as he said, like how invested he was in that mentality early on, that he almost didn't even realize that there was something like that he needed to get. Because when you are fulfilled in yourself, the external stuff, it's not that it isn't it's 0% relevant, but it almost is, in a sense, because it doesn't mean anything about you. And there was a point, I don't know if I remember the exact quote, but when Socrates was talking about being something and being more, and recognizing basically that you can't be more, and therefore you can't be less. And so there is nothing to get for the things that you're doing. It's just in each and every moment doing it for the sake of doing it. Like that's really what he recognized. And in that, when you're doing things for the sake of doing them, there isn't anything less left for the garbage in your mind to cling to. Like because every time we're doing something for an external thing, there is always both desire and fear with everything that we try and do when we're caught up in the idea of ourselves. When we're trying to maintain, build up, fear being lost, it's always fear and desire. Those two things. And without the need to attain any more, become anything more, get anything more, you're doing things for the sake of doing them. And there isn't that simultaneous fear and desire in that moment, because they go hand in hand. As soon as you're only afraid because you're desiring something. You're desiring something, and there comes the fear if you don't get it, if you don't live up to it. Because everything's on the line. If you don't get the gold, then you're nothing. You're worthless. You're not worth anything without that. And so it's always those two when you're striving and doing something for the sake of doing it. And I had one more point with the going back to the materialism. It is interesting. I haven't really thought of it like that. When you're showing someone something materialistic, like I've understood this for sure, and they just don't care, how it becomes 0% relevant at all. Like, you get a nice car or something, a nice new car, and you show someone, and you're super excited, and they're just like, oh yeah, nice. And it's like they respond, they're cordial about it, but they're not like, oh my God, that's so nice. Or a watch, or a pair of shoes, or a suit, or anything. And so it really just shows how it isn't worth anything unless someone thinks that it is. I get it and people respond with like, oh, well, sometimes it's higher quality. Sometimes you like it for the sake of liking it. Yeah. Yeah. If you really want to get a nice car because you like to drive fast, absolutely go for it. I'm not saying there's anything wrong with that whatsoever. It's just, you know, you listening, anyone listening, you know, when you're doing something for you and you're doing something to be seen in a certain way. And if you can tell very quickly by that example Ray said, if you show it to someone or tell someone about it and they have a very neutral response, does it hurt or not? Because if it hurts, probably not doing it for you.
One thing I really enjoy about Socrates' character is actually, there's a lot of things I enjoy about Socrates' character, but mostly it's his sense of humor, admittedly. And it's his long game in terms of how patient he is in teaching a lesson. So, for example, when he meets Dan and he's like, okay, I'm going to help you, I'm going to train you. No alcohol, no sex, no parties, no TV. And slowly, Dan starts to look like a bag of shit. Like his friends are like, dude, you look terrible. And it's only because he hasn't been giving in to so many habits. He hasn't been giving in to so many distractions. And so his false certainty is starting to fade, but his awareness is starting to expand, which means that he's starting to learn about himself. So all of a sudden, he's not full of that bravado. He's not wearing that mask to the same degree. And it's changing him, but it's also bringing him closer to the present because he's not getting lost in so many habits. And then when he finally does start to get this mentality, what does Socrates do? He takes him out, lights a big fat stogie, and has a drink. And he makes the point that it isn't about not doing those things, it's about the lack of awareness. It's about the habit. That's the problem. And that's the only problem. Otherwise, you're just making a choice. And if you're doing so out of awareness, likely that choice is going to reflect the same balance that you have found in yourself.
Yeah, I think the quote is every action has a price and pleasure. Recognize this and remain realistic and responsible. Something along those lines. That's what I jotted down in my fucking scribbled out handwriting. But it it is. I loved that part too. The sort of duality of that message because it isn't one thing. It's not an answer. And a lot of people in the spiritual community think that it is, think that there is an answer, think that, the initial part, the no sex, no alcohol, no partying, no nothing, nothing, no vices, period. Oh, that's it. Oh, that's the answer. I figured it out. Just have to do that. This was like me like 4 years ago when I thought it was just gratitude. Oh, I just have to be grateful. Oh fuck. I can remember very vividly thinking that and thinking, oh my God, I think I got it. I just have to be grateful. If I'm just grateful all the time, and if shit starts going bad, just be grateful for something else. It'll bring me out of it. And it did. It worked for a while until it didn't. Until I butted up against it that week before I realized that it wasn't the gratitude, it wasn't the things, it was just me. And so anyway, with that, a lot of people cling to and they just want to find that answer. And they want to, like with one of the what was the first tenet, the three life has three rules, the paradox, don't try to figure life out. That's kind of it. It's like it doesn't mean don't stay curious, but it's don't think that there's a single answer that you're going to be able to settle upon and just hold on to that forever. Because the third tenet was change, nothing stays the same. So it's like you got to maintain all of that. And it's just awareness here and now. That's all it is. It's not settling upon an answer. And even, listening to a podcast, and I get caught in this sometimes, listening to something, I'm like, oh, I should jot this down. I should take notes. It's just the same recognition over and over and over. Just be where you're at. You don't need to hold on to anything. You don't need to maintain anything. And so that the situation where he tells him all that stuff, no vices basically, and then brings it back in because it's not about one end or the other. It's not about cutting out all these things. Oh, this is the answer. If I just have this routine, if I just cut these things out, then I'll be good. It's about maintaining that balance and awareness and responsibility. And there's a point when cutting all that stuff out, thinking that you have to do that, becomes another crutch. It really does, because you lack awareness and responsibility. So you feel like you have to stay away from all of that stuff. And that it comes kind of full circle. That's the other end of the spectrum. And you can kind of bounce off that for a bit. And it's still diminishing your sense of, I don't know, awareness, responsibility in each and every moment. So it's not about settling upon anything, because then you just stagnate and reality continues on. It's just about remaining aware each and every moment. And, with devices, everything in moderation, including moderation.
And I think that is one of my favorite parts about that scene with the cigar and the drink, is the response from Dan, like, well, we're better than that, though. And Socrates' response, there is no better, and therefore there is no worse. And that's the lesson. But that's what I mean about how well he teaches the long game. And of course, I mean, it's working out in an ideal way because it's a movie. But the other scene that I really enjoyed, there's a few, and I'm going to bring them up before the end of this review, was when he just told him to go sit on that car until you have an insight worth sharing. I absolutely loved that scene because half of those insights were good. It's not that they weren't good. It's just that it was the act of digging, the act of just sitting there and sorting through all of the things that are a part of you, that eventually led him to an insight where you could see not just the insight was valid, because of course it was an insight they had discussed previously, but the look on his face, it was the way he brought it across. You could see this was something that was profound to me, not just something that sounded good, but something that genuinely hit. And the lesson, of course, was that there are no ordinary moments. Well, how did he learn that outside of having a whole bunch of moments just sitting on a car?
Yeah, no, I love that scene, because I think in hearing those, I kind of knew as I was watching it, like there was going to be, after he came back with like one or two, like he is staying. I don't know. It was almost like he was looking outside of himself, and all the insights were from the external and things that sounded good and that were kind of witty, but he was still kind of avoiding the the recognition himself and like the responsibility that is taken with that. And so I was thinking, I was watching it like, ooh, maybe he'll come to one just about he'll come back with I'm not what I think I am, or something like that. And it was about the moments, and there not being any ordinary moments, which is, it's all intertwined, because through recognizing that, that's what causes people to not pay attention to where they're at. When you recognize that there are no ordinary moments, there are no just mundane things happening, there's always something happening. You realize that, oh, I gotta pay attention. This is all that I am. Like this moment is all that I am. And so through that, there's just so much depth that you can dig into. But I found it, yeah, interesting how he kept coming to different sort of realizations through that, and they were all still applicable. Like he even brought some up later in the film too, that hit. But you can tell with people too, like when we have conversations with people, a lot of times they'll kind of want to focus on certain things that are avoiding the insight that would really hit. And yeah, I've done this plenty of times. I do this all the time, and when you're avoiding something, and no one can tell you, no one's gonna be, because then it's them projecting. It's not gonna hit the same until you figure it out yourself. But I do find that can be common when people have a certain thing that they're working on or going through, and they don't want to face it. Like, you can't avoid it. It's going to keep coming up. It's going to keep coming up in different ways, shapes, and forms. And you can skirt around it as much as you want, but eventually it's going to hit, and it's going to hit. And I think the more you skirt it, the heavier it's going to hit. It's almost like it's like a slingshot that keeps getting, at first it's just pulled back a little, so like, that won't feel great, and then as you keep avoiding it, it keeps getting pulled back more and more and more and more and more until it's like super fucking, and then it just smacks you, and it doesn't feel great, but it's still, even just the willingness to take the responsibility and look at it for what it is and stop trying to avoid it, which you can do having all different sorts of insights all the time, but eventually you got to face the one, and it differs for everyone to a degree, but it all circles around the same sort of insight, I would say.
And it's always in the experience that we don't want, like the experience of disappointment, for example, that is felt by Dan at the end of the movie when Socrates tells him, I've been waiting forever to take you on this walk. There's something I got to show you. You're going to love this. You finally earned this experience. And he takes him on this giant walk, and he gets to the top of this mountain. Not even the top. It just chooses an arbitrary place and says, yeah, that's what we're here to see. And it's just an ordinary rock. And Dan feels all kinds of disappointment. But in that disappointment is the lesson that is always within the disappointment, which is usually that you were striving towards an end result, but the journey itself was the reward. It's just how caught up you got in the end result that causes the disappointment and causes that fall into suffering. And so really it's just about enjoying the journey for whatever it is without getting too caught up in needing to go anywhere or be anything. And that's ultimately the lesson behind everything, right? And we just put it off. Dan, for example, when he finally had that moment on the pommel horse and he was present and he was kicking ass, and then he's like, aha, I've got a trick. This is going to work for me. And he started pursuing the quote unquote training, and it was making him more uncertain. And finally, he just had his breaking point. He's just like, nope, I'm going back to the ego. I'm going to go back to control. I'm going to go back to a lack of awareness, which ultimately led to his accident, which ultimately led to him not having a way to continue to establish his value. He was no longer able to do this thing, and therefore no longer able to compete against the friends that were so important for him in terms of how to measure himself. Everything was always about how to measure himself. And when he didn't have that left, there was only suicide. But the important part, and the reason that we call it ego death, is that it is dying without dying. It's killing the idea of yourself as being something that's important. And in that, you can live your life without there being anything on the line. But it really is learning that lesson. And that lesson comes through disappointment. It comes through kind of edging your way around it and ignoring it and trying not to see it. And then finally just getting hit in the face with it and offered the opportunity again to see it. Are you willing to see it? Are you ready? It's up to you.
Yeah, because when you're so caught in being used to measuring yourself and measuring your value, it's all relative. It's all completely made up and arbitrary. But when you are so used to that, it takes a disappointment usually to recognize that. Like, it's almost necessary in some way, shape, or form. And there could be the argument that it isn't, but I think given just the process of it, of ego development, it is something that's built. It's something that we measure, and we almost need something. Not saying it has to be anything insanely drastic, but some sort of disappointment, some sort of way to see that, oh, maybe this isn't everything I am. Maybe this isn't the reality of what I am. Maybe measuring my value isn't something that's actually a necessary part of my life. And it's through that disappointment, through kind of going back to, hitting some sort of rock bottom or relative rock bottom, that you can see that and you can let it go. Like, I don't know if it could happen without that. And so through that, then though, you start to just understand the fullness of each moment, because I think and just how much the destination is the journey, as cliche as that may seem. We get so caught in thinking there's a spot that we're getting to. Like, we're all striving for this arbitrary point that we just continue having to make up, thinking that that's when it's going to happen. We do it all the time. I think we do it so much more than we ever realize. Sure, you can set 10, 20-year goals, but it's like little stuff every single day. Can't feel okay until this happens, till this person, you send a text to someone you like. You're like, I can't be happy until this person responds. Even that, it's like maybe a 5-minute sort of gap there. We're always doing that. And so I think recognizing that there's nowhere else, and then you start to realize, oh, that's not it. You can start having these recognitions that the journey is what it is, but then you think of all the endpoints that you always thought there were. You're like, wait, then what is it? Like, well, then where am I going? And that's just it. That's the discomfort at first that you start to feel until you recognize that it doesn't really change anything. You're still where you're at. It's just without these arbitrary things that you're pushing off your feelings of, at least not even happiness. I don't love using just that word, but contentment, peace, being in a spot where you're not trying to be anything, basically. And that spot is always now. It's always now. And this is the same conversation we've been having for so long, but I think we, even in the smallest ways, get caught in pushing off those feelings until we get this thing. Oh, until this feeling stops, until this shitty feeling that I'm feeling right now, until it stops, or until, you're not feeling great. Once this stops, then I'll be okay. But you can be okay in those spots. You can be okay in those feelings, in those emotions, in those situations. You don't have to keep pushing it off, because it's just a habit, I think, we've gotten very unaware of in how often we push off that ability to be okay with what is. And we do it in different ways throughout almost our entire lives.
Mostly because we just avoid the uncertainty that would help us recognize that we're okay in uncertainty. We end up settling for false certainty, which leads me to the last scene that I want to mention from this movie, where Socrates throws Dan off a bridge. I really enjoyed that scene because the lesson behind it was how present Dan was while in midair on the way into the water. He wasn't thinking about anything else other than the experience that he was having. And that moment in itself shook him. That's all it took. That's why Socrates was saying, I helped you clear your mind. And of course, at that point, Dan's really upset, but that's what led him to actually paying attention to what was happening around him. That's what led him to that moment where he tuned in to the people with the dog in the park and the whole thing, because he was paying attention. Well, why is he paying attention? Because he wasn't thinking about where he was going. He wasn't thinking about how important it was that he get to his competition. He was experiencing being dripping wet after being thrown in a pond, and he was very involved with that experience. And that's it. There's a lesson in that uncertainty itself will help you expand your awareness and realize more of what you are already doing that you might have been distracting yourself from before. And that's the last scene I want to bring up in this movie.
Yeah, no, one of my favorite ones too, because in that spot when he was just involved in the situation, where he's just sitting there after coming out of the water, pissed off, soaking wet. He's just like focused on, he's focused on himself and how wet he is and all that stuff, but he's there, bored. He's not thinking about where he's going, where he's getting, because even those are sort of like the I've talked in the past about when I'm walking my dog and the leash is tight versus when it's not, and that feeling of relativity, kind of knowing where she is, having that certainty of how far she is, which direction she's in, and then if she's closer to me, there's slack on the leash. I don't necessarily know, and I think that is what sitting in uncertainty is recognizing just how little you know at that point. He had his tryout to get back to. He had all these things going on in his life, his larger goals, getting a gold medal, whatever it may be. And none of those are certain. None of those are certain. The only certain thing was the moment he was experiencing, and he wasn't paying attention to that. So then, you get to that point where you get to the thing that you think is so certain that wasn't, but you eventually get there, gets to the tryout. And if you're not attentive there, then you're going to miss that too. And you're just going to keep missing things because once you get to the tryout, then it's what is this? Where is this getting me? Where is this going? What am I becoming because of this? And so it really is a practice, really is a practice, being attentive to where you're at, being fully involved in the experience that you're in. And it means both physically and very much so mentally, because, with technology, I get caught in this too. You start watching a movie or watching a show, and then, your phone buzzes, and then you're looking at that, and then you got fucking two screens in front of you, and it's like, Jesus Christ. So we can't even be attentive to the most basic things. Attention spans on TikTok are probably sub 1 second now for when people are in their doom scroll on their For You page, and it's just getting lower and lower. And it's a practice because we've been practicing not paying attention, basically, and that gets involved in everything. And so we're always trying to get somewhere else, trying to get to another spot, and we are practicing not paying attention. So how the fuck do you think you're going to be able to pay attention when you get to that place that you think is going to cure everything? You're not. You're not going to be paying attention to that. That's going to mean something else about you, or it's what Socrates said at one point: all humanity shares your predicament. You don't get what you want, and therefore you suffer. But even when you do get it, you still suffer because you can't hold on to it forever. And so it doesn't matter whether you get what you want. As long as you're using that as an excuse to feel better, it's not going to last. Even if you get it, it's not going to last because you can't hold on to it forever. So the only reasonable response, the only reasonable thing to do is to practice paying attention. It is to be fully involved with what you're in. And on the mental side, it means letting go of where you're going, what it means about you, what you think you're becoming, having the idea that you could be better. Because you can't. You can't do anything to be better. You can't do a single fucking thing to be better. Ever. So you might as well pay attention to where you're at, right? Because you're not going anywhere. And therefore you can't be any worse.
But it's important to recognize that it is a practice. It's not a one-time understanding that you're going to come to one day and go, oh, that's it. It's a practice, which is exactly what Socrates was saying to Dan after he had his moment of triumph being present on the pommel horse. But how long were you present for? Now you're back here gloating about the past. And that's it. It really comes down to the practice, understanding that it is actually a transition to a deeper way of experiencing existence and life as a whole, because it is life that you're experiencing. We're just distracted most of the time. And that's the way of the peaceful warrior. I really enjoyed this movie. This has been a great review. Thanks so much for watching this one. I know it's a long one. It's 2 hours long for anybody who hasn't watched it yet. If you haven't watched it yet and you've already made it through this review, still go and watch the movie because it's really good. The acting is good. It's really funny. They do a good job of showing the second of the 3 rules of life, which is humor. I really appreciate the humor that is brought across in this movie. Despite all of the insights and all of the things that happen to the main character, they really do a good job of keeping it light and making it quite profound.
Yeah, I really enjoyed that component. And I think because in this conversation too, with all of those and stoicism or spirituality, I think humor is the one component that's missing the most. Like people get so fucking fixated on their stuff, doing the right thing, saying the right stuff, having the right answer. And like, I really don't see it in speakers who talk about this stuff. Like it's very much like, I don't know, can be very mundane. I will say that Sadhguru, he can be kind of funny sometimes. I will definitely give him that. But yeah, a lot of them, I think that's a massive component that we kind of discount because I think it's probably because it's not perceived to get you anywhere. it's something that you're just is what it is. It's for the sake of doing it. It's not to become anything. And I think that's maybe the one that's probably the reason that, the egotistical spiritual conversation doesn't isn't geared towards that, because you need to be seen in a certain way. And there's an image of being enlightened that doesn't involve humor necessarily. But when you recognize that you're not going anywhere and you're just sitting in eternity, might as well have some fun with it. So anyway, that's I think that's all we got. So I appreciate everyone for tuning in. Definitely watch it. Again, even if you listen to the whole thing, it is a very, very good movie. I think it'll hit home for everyone. So appreciate you tuning in, and we'll talk to you soon.
Bye, everyone.